My family abandoned my wedding, all 43 of them left before the vows, then my husband got the bill. I was standing at the altar in a dress that cost me 4 months of waitressing tips. I had no idea I was about to become the punchline of my own father's revenge plan. 206 guests. 43 of them vanished 20 minutes before I said I do. My mother. My sisters. Every aunt and uncle. Gone, all at once, on cue, like someone had flipped a switch. My husband took both my hands. He leaned in. And he whispered the sentence I still hear at 3 in the morning. He said, "Mara, I think I know why they left, and it's about to get worse." He had no idea how right he was. 6 weeks later, an invoice for $11,400 landed on my father's own doorstep. For a disaster he had quietly engineered, line by line, weeks before he ever walked out on me. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how he did it. And you'll know exactly how it blew up in his face. But before I tell you what happened, hit like and subscribe, and drop your city and your local time in the comments. Okay. Let me take you back. I should tell you who I am first. Because I think it matters for understanding why my family did what they did. My name is Mara Castillo. Well, it was Castillo. Now it's Castillo Reyes. I refused to give up my name when I got married. And that small decision turned out to be the first crack in a wall that had been building for a long, long time. I grew up in Modesto, California, the youngest of 4 daughters in a family that loved loudly and judged just as loudly. My father, Reynaldo Castillo, ran a small auto body shop on the east side of town for 31 years. My mother, Elena, kept the books for him, and kept the rest of us in line with a look that could end an argument from across a room. My 3 older sisters, Lucia, Vanessa, and Teresa, were 8, 6, and 4 years older than me. By the time I came along, the family had already decided what kind of family it was going to be. Catholic. Traditional. A family where the daughters married men their fathers approved of, had the wedding at Our Lady of Fatima, and stayed within 20 minutes of Modesto for the rest of their lives. Lucia married a contractor named Hector when she was 23. Vanessa married a man named Paul who worked for the county. Teresa married young too, at 21, to a guy named Ben who'd grown up 2 streets over from us. All 3 weddings looked basically the same. Same church. Same reception hall on McHenry Avenue. Same DJ, a man named Ricky Soto who had been doing Castillo family events since I was 12 years old. There was an unspoken script. And every one of my sisters had followed it. I did not follow it. I left Modesto at 18 for a partial scholarship to UC Santa Cruz. My father called it a waste of perfectly good tuition money on a school that teaches kids to disrespect their parents. My mother quietly funded an extra $2,000 toward it, without telling him. I studied environmental science. I waited tables at a seafood place on the wharf to cover what the scholarship didn't. And in my junior year, in a class on coastal policy, I sat next to a guy who kept arguing with the professor in a way that was somehow never annoying. Always sharp. Always backed up with an actual point. That was Daniel Reyes. Daniel was from Sacramento. His father, Arturo, had passed away when Daniel was 19, of a heart attack at his desk at the engineering firm where he'd worked for 2 decades. His mother, Carol, was a retired elementary school teacher. Soft-spoken. The kind of woman who remembered your coffee order after meeting you once. Daniel had one younger brother, Mike, who was finishing a graphic design degree at the time we met. That was it. 4 people, total, on Daniel's side. No big extended family descending on holidays. No script to follow. Just a small, quiet family that mostly left each other alone and trusted each other to be fine. I want to be clear. I'm not telling you this to make my family look bad just because they were big and loud, and Daniel's was small and quiet. Big loud families are wonderful. I loved being part of mine for 18 years. The problem was never the size. The problem was what happened underneath the noise. The expectations nobody said out loud, until you broke one of them. And then, suddenly, everyone had plenty to say. Daniel and I dated for 4 years before he proposed. We did the slow thing on purpose. Finished school. Got our first apartments. Watched some of our friends rush into marriages that fell apart within 2 years. And decided we'd rather be boring and careful. He proposed on a Tuesday, which I loved, because Tuesday meant it wasn't about a performance. It was just the day he couldn't wait any longer. We got engaged in October of 2023. I called my mother that same night, practically vibrating, and she said, Mija, that's wonderful. And I believed her. Because at the time, I had no reason not to. The first sign that something was off came about 3 weeks later, at Sunday dinner at my parents' house. My father asked, in front of everyone, "So when do we start planning at Fatima? Father Solis is going to need the date soon if you want a good Saturday." And I said, gently, that Daniel and I were actually thinking about something smaller. Maybe at a venue. Maybe not even Catholic, since Daniel wasn't really practicing, and I hadn't been to Mass regularly since college. The table went quiet in that specific way that I now recognize as the sound of a family recalibrating its opinion of you in real time. My mother recovered first. "Well, it's your wedding," she said, in a tone that made it extremely clear she did not believe that sentence even as she said it. My father didn't recover at all. He just looked at his plate and said, That single syllable carried more weight than a full lecture would have. I want to pause here and say, comment below if you've ever had a family member say one quiet word that told you exactly how disappointed they were. More than a full argument ever could. Because that followed me around for the next 8 months. It was in the back of my mind every time I made a decision about this wedding. The next few months were a slow accumulation of small frictions. My sister Vanessa called to ask, very casually, whether I'd asked Father Solis yet. And when I said no, we'd actually booked a venue called Oak Hollow out near Murphy's, in the Sierra foothills, about 90 minutes from Modesto, she went quiet on the phone, in a way I'd later learn meant she was already texting Lucia about it. My mother started asking pointed questions about the guest list. Specifically, whether all 4 of my Tia Rosa's children were invited. Whether my father's cousins from Stockton were invited. Whether we were doing the thing where the groom's side and bride's side traditionally split costs, the way Castillo weddings always had. That last question turned out to matter more than I understood at the time. In my family, there's an old, mostly unspoken tradition. The bride's family pays for the venue, food, and flowers. The groom's family pays for the rehearsal dinner, the alcohol, and the band or DJ. It's not written anywhere. It's just how it had always been done. Because my father had grown up watching his own father do it that way. And his father before him. When Lucia, Vanessa, and Teresa got married, their husbands' families were small-town Modesto families who knew the script and played their part without anyone having to explain it. Hector's parents paid for the open bar at Lucia's wedding without blinking. Paul's father, a retired sheriff's deputy, handled Vanessa's DJ and alcohol bill of about $3,800 without a second thought. Daniel's family was 4 people. His mother was retired on a teacher's pension. His brother Mike was a year out of school. There was no groom's side with deep pockets ready to step in and cover a $4,000 bar tab as a matter of cultural obligation. Because that wasn't a tradition they'd ever participated in. Nobody had ever explained this tradition to Daniel directly. It had just sort of existed in the air around my family, assumed and never spoken, until the moment it wasn't honored. I didn't think much of it at first, honestly. Daniel and I were paying for most of the wedding ourselves anyway. We'd been saving since the engagement, splitting costs evenly, treating it as our wedding, rather than a Castillo production. We'd budgeted around $31,000 total for everything. Venue, catering, the dress, flowers, photography, the DJ, the bar. We didn't expect either family to cover much. We expected my parents, maybe, to chip in for something meaningful as a gesture, the way parents often do. But we weren't counting on it. And we definitely weren't operating under some unspoken rule that Daniel's mother needed to write a check for the open bar. I found out, much later, that my father had been quietly stewing about this exact issue for months. It had become a sort of obsession for him. Not really about the money, but about what he called respect. He told my Tio Beto, who later told me, that a man who can't show up for his own wedding the right way doesn't respect what he's marrying into. I want you to sit with that for a second. Because it's going to come back around in a way that's almost funny, if it weren't so painful. In February, 5 months out from the wedding, we had what I'll call the dinner. My parents invited Daniel and me over, and it started normally enough. My mother had made pozole. My father was in a decent mood, asking Daniel about work. Daniel works as a structural engineer. Decent salary, stable job. The kind of son-in-law most fathers would be thrilled with, on paper. About halfway through dinner, my father set down his spoon and said, "So I want to talk about who's handling what for the wedding." Daniel, to his credit, didn't flinch. He said, "Sure, we're happy to talk through it. Mara and I have got most of it covered between us." My father said, "Most of it? What about the bar? The DJ?" Daniel said, "We've got a DJ booked, a guy out of Sonora, costs about $2,200 for the night. We're handling the bar too. We got a quote from the venue's caterer. It's coming in around $6,000 for an open bar for 180 guests." My father nodded slowly and said, "And your mother? Mike? They're not putting anything toward that?" There it was. Out in the open, finally. Daniel looked at me. And I jumped in, because I could see exactly where this was going, and I wanted to head it off. I said, "Dad, Daniel's family doesn't really do it that way. His mom offered to help with whatever we needed, but we told her we had it covered. This isn't really a tradition on his side." My father set his fork down completely. He looked at my mother, then back at me, and said, "It's not a tradition on his side because his side has never married into our family before. That's not how this works, Mara. Lucia's wedding, Hector's father paid for everything from the church doors to the dance floor. Vanessa's, Paul's father handled the whole bar himself, didn't even ask. Teresa's the same. This is what we do. This is what respect looks like." I said, calmly, "Dad, I love you, but that's not a real rule. That's just what happened to work out 3 times because their families happen to have the money and the tradition already. Daniel's mom is retired. She's not loaded. We're not going to ask her to write a $6,000 check for alcohol." And my father said the thing that I now understand was the actual root of everything that followed. He said, "Then maybe he's not ready to be part of this family." My mother tried to soften it. She said something about how he didn't mean it like that. But I could see in her face that she agreed with him. She just wasn't going to be the one to say it that bluntly. Daniel stayed quiet and calm the entire drive home. And I remember him finally saying, somewhere on Highway 99, "I think your dad just told us he's keeping score." He was right. My father absolutely was keeping score. And I had no idea yet how far he was willing to take it. Comment below if you've ever had a parent treat a financial tradition like a referendum on whether your partner truly loves you. I think it's more common than people admit. After the dinner, things got quieter. Which, in my family, is never a good sign. Quiet, in the Castillo household, is the calm before a coordinated response. My mother stopped asking detailed questions about the wedding. My sisters, who used to text me constantly about dress shopping and venues, went mostly silent in the group chat we'd had since Vanessa's wedding planning days. I told myself they were busy. Lucia had 3 kids under 10 and a full-time job. Vanessa had just started a new position at the county assessor's office. Teresa was renovating her kitchen. I gave them every excuse. Because the alternative, that they were pulling away on purpose, felt too lonely to sit with. In March, 4 months out, I had what I thought was a good conversation with my mother. We met for coffee at a place near her house, just the two of us, and she seemed warmer than she had in weeks. She asked about the dress, about the flowers, about whether I was nervous. Near the end, almost as an afterthought, she said, "Your father still feels strongly about the bar situation, Mija. I'm not saying I agree with everything he says, but I think it would mean a lot to him if Daniel's mother offered something. Even a small amount. It's about the gesture." I said I'd talk to Daniel about it, mostly to keep the peace. And I did talk to him. And Daniel, being the kind of person he is, actually called his mother and asked, gently, whether she'd be comfortable contributing something, even symbolically, toward the bar or the DJ, just to smooth things over with my family. Carol, God bless her, said she'd be happy to put in $500 toward the DJ. Which was generous for her. Genuinely generous, given her fixed income. We told my mother. My mother relayed it to my father. He said it wasn't enough. Not in terms of the dollar amount. In terms of what it represented. He apparently told my mother, $500 is an insult, not a gesture. It says he doesn't take this seriously. I didn't even know that part until after the wedding. At the time, all I knew was that my mother said, vaguely, he appreciates it, but I think there's still some tension. Tension. That word did a lot of quiet work over those next few months. Covering for something much bigger that I wasn't being told. In April, 3 months out, the dress fitting happened. And this is the moment I think back to most. Because it's when the abandonment really started, even though I didn't recognize it as abandonment yet. I'd asked my mother and all 3 sisters to come to my final fitting at a bridal shop in Stockton. It was supposed to be a whole afternoon. Fitting, then lunch. The kind of thing you see in movies. Lucia canceled the morning of. Said one of her kids had a fever. Vanessa came, but left after 40 minutes. Said she had a work thing she'd forgotten about. Teresa never responded to the group text at all. My mother showed up, sat through the fitting, took exactly 4 photos, and spent most of the lunch afterward checking her phone. I remember standing in that dress, the one I'd later wear at the altar, watching my mother's face in the mirror's reflection instead of my own. Trying to read whether she was actually happy for me, or just present. I couldn't tell. I still can't, fully, even now. Comment below if you've ever caught a parent or sibling just going through the motions at something that was supposed to be a big moment for you. And you knew, somewhere underneath, that something was wrong, even if you couldn't name it yet. By May, 2 months out, the wedding website was up. The RSVPs were rolling in. And out of the 206 people invited, every single member of my extended family had RSVP'd yes. All 43 of them. My parents. My 3 sisters, their husbands, their 7 kids combined. My aunts Rosa and Carmen. My uncles Beto and Frank. My cousins. Even my great-aunt Dolores, who was 81 and lived in an assisted living facility in Turlock, and had to arrange transportation. Every yes. I remember feeling relieved when I saw that. Like maybe the tension my mother kept mentioning had passed. Like maybe my father had let it go, the way he usually let things go after enough time. I genuinely believed, 2 months before my wedding, that the worst of it was behind us. I was wrong. And the reason I was wrong is something I only learned afterward, from my cousin Marisol, who was 24, and the only person in my extended family who eventually told me the truth without flinching. According to Marisol, my father had decided, sometime in late April, that he was going to attend the wedding. That he wasn't going to make a scene by skipping it, or causing a fight beforehand. But that he was not going to let what he saw as a disrespect of family tradition go unanswered. He told my Tio Beto, in a conversation Marisol overheard, "I'm not going to ruin Mara's day before it happens. But I'm not paying for things to look one way when they're not. If they want to do it their way, they can do it their way completely." I didn't understand what that meant until the day itself. None of us did. Except, apparently, my father, my mother, and at least a dozen relatives who'd been quietly looped in over those final 2 months. Here's a detail that matters a lot. So stay with me. Back in March, when my father first started this respect campaign about the bar tab, the venue, Oak Hollow, required a credit card on file for incidentals. Extra hours, breakage, additional bar consumption beyond the package. Daniel and I had put down our joint card for the deposit and signed the contract together. But sometime in early May, my father called the venue directly. He told them he was the bride's father. Asked some detailed questions about payment structure. And, this is the part that still makes my jaw tighten, he asked whether it was possible to be added as an additional authorized contact on the account, in case the couple needs help managing logistics day of. The venue coordinator, a woman named Brenda, who I will defend to my dying day for being thorough, called Daniel to confirm before adding anyone. Daniel told her no, that wasn't necessary, and thought nothing more of it. He mentioned it to me in passing, and we both shrugged it off as my dad being controlling. Which, fair. That tracked. What we didn't know is that my father had also, separately, contacted the bar service Daniel had hired. A company called Poor Decisions, based out of Sonora, and asked detailed questions about their cancellation policy. About what would happen if the guest count dropped significantly day of. About overage charges if alcohol consumption ran higher than the headcount-based package. The bar company, having no reason to be suspicious of a friendly father of the bride asking logistics questions, answered him fully and helpfully. He learned that the contract had a clause. If fewer than the contracted minimum number of guests were served, the couple still owed the full minimum package price. But if consumption ran high among the guests who did attend, overage charges applied per drink beyond the package limit. He learned the venue had a similar clause for catering. Minimum guaranteed headcount, with the couple on the hook for that minimum, regardless of who showed up to eat it. He was doing the math months before the wedding. He was building a plan, quietly. The way he must have learned to build a quote at the body shop. Find the contract's pressure points. Calculate the cost. Then decide whether it's worth doing the job. I want to be fair to my father in this story, even though what he did was cruel. Because I think understanding why makes it sadder, rather than more justified. He was 61 years old. He had built a life around a specific idea of family. One where daughters married into ready-made systems of support. Where the in-laws showed up with checkbooks open as proof of commitment. Where loyalty was demonstrated through money, because that's the language he'd grown up speaking. Daniel didn't speak that language. Not out of disrespect. But because his family had never needed to. And instead of having an honest conversation about it, my father decided the wedding day itself would be the venue for making his point. The week of the wedding arrived, and everything seemed, on the surface, completely normal. Lucia helped me with final seating chart questions. Vanessa came over to help steam the dress. Teresa dropped off the welcome bags she'd offered to assemble for out-of-town guests, full of little local snacks, and a handwritten note in her looping handwriting that said, "So happy for you, see you Saturday." My mother called every day, asking about timing, about hair and makeup appointments. Sounding, if anything, more present than she had in months. Looking back, I think this was the part that hurt the most, when I eventually understood it. That the warmth in that final week wasn't fake, exactly. But it also wasn't the whole truth. They knew what was coming. They were being kind to me on the way to doing something that would devastate me. And I think some of them, maybe most of them, told themselves it was for a good reason. Loyalty to my father. Loyalty to the family. A lesson that needed to be taught. Even if I was the one who'd end up paying for it. Literally. The morning of the wedding, June 14th of this year, was beautiful. Clear sky. 78 degrees. The foothills around Oak Hollow green from a wet spring. I got my hair and makeup done in a little cottage on the property with my 2 bridesmaids, my college roommate Priya, and Daniel's cousin Sophia, who'd flown in from Texas. My mother came by the cottage around 11. helped me into the dress. Cried a little, real tears, I think, even now I believe those were real, and told me I looked beautiful. She left around noon to go get dressed herself and help seat arriving guests. I had no idea that was the last normal conversation I'd have with her for the next several hours. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock, outdoors, under a wooden arbor strung with eucalyptus and white ranunculus that I'd spent way too long picking out. Guests started arriving around 3:30. I was in the cottage, peeking through the curtains with Priya, watching people find their seats. Feeling that specific electric nervousness that I think anyone who's gotten married recognizes. I saw my tia Rosa arrive in a bright blue dress. I saw my cousin Marisol arrive with her boyfriend. I saw Hector and Lucia's kids running around in their little wedding outfits before being wrangled into chairs. Around 3:40, the venue coordinator, Brenda, came to find me. And she had a strange look on her face. The kind of look that makes your stomach drop before anyone says a word. She said, "Mara, I don't want to alarm you, but I think you should know. A group of your guests just left." I said, "Left? Left where?" She said, "Left the property. About 40 people, maybe more. They got up together, walked to the parking area, and drove off." It looked coordinated. I remember laughing. Actually laughing. Because it sounded so absurd that I assumed it had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe there was a bathroom situation. Maybe a shuttle mix-up. I asked Priya to go check. And she came back 2 minutes later, pale, holding her phone, and said, "Mara, your mom's car is gone. Your sister's cars are gone." I counted. There's, like, a whole section of empty chairs on the left side. The left side. The Castillo side. My side. I walked out of the cottage, still in my dress, and looked across the lawn at the ceremony space. And Brenda was right. There was a clean, visible gap where 40-some chairs sat empty in neat rows. While the right side, Daniel's side, smaller but full, sat completely intact. Confused. Murmuring to each other. I counted later, from the seating chart. Exactly 43 people who'd been there 20 minutes before, and were now simply gone. My parents. My sisters and their husbands. My nieces and nephews. My aunts, my uncles, my cousins. Even 81-year-old Tia Dolores, who I later learned had been picked up by my cousin Marisol's mother specifically to be driven home early, even though Marisol herself had refused to go, and stayed. I want to pause here and say, if you've ever had something happen at a milestone moment in your life that felt so unbelievable, you genuinely thought you were misunderstanding it, comment below. Because that disbelief, that specific kind of confusion, is its own particular flavor of pain. And I don't think people talk about it enough. Daniel found me a few minutes later, already in his suit, having heard the same news from his brother Mike. He didn't ask a single question about logistics. He didn't ask whether we should delay. Whether we should chase anyone down. Whether we should call my mother. He just took both my hands and said, "Do you still want to marry me today?" I said yes. Immediately. Without hesitation. Through tears that were ruining the makeup I'd paid $200 for that morning. He said, "Then that's what we're doing. Everyone else's noise." And then he said the thing I mentioned at the start of this story. He leaned in, lowered his voice so only I could hear it, and said, "Mara, I think I know why they left, and it's about to get worse." I asked him what he meant. And he said he'd explain everything after the ceremony. That right now, the only thing that mattered was walking down that aisle. And that he didn't want anything, not his suspicions, not my family, not anything, to take that moment away from me a second time. So we did it. We got married in front of 160-some guests instead of 206. In front of an aisle with one whole side mostly empty. In front of Priya and Sophia, who were both crying. In front of Daniel's mother Carol, who held my hand afterward and said, "I am so sorry, and I am so proud of you," in a voice that broke in the middle. Father Solis wasn't there, obviously, since we hadn't gotten married Catholic. But the officiant we'd hired, a kind woman named Janet who did civil ceremonies throughout the foothills, handled the obvious tension in the room with a grace I'll be grateful for as long as I live. She adjusted her opening remarks on the fly. Said something simple and warm about how a wedding is made by the people who choose to stay, not the size of the crowd. And somehow, that line got us through it, without either of us breaking down completely. We got married at 4:22 in the afternoon. 22 minutes behind schedule. In front of roughly 160 people who actually wanted to be there. The reception happened anyway. The band played. People danced. Daniel's co-workers, who barely knew me, made an effort to come find me throughout the night and tell me how happy they were for us. In a way that felt like they somehow understood, without being told, exactly how much that mattered in that specific moment. My college friends formed an unofficial wall of support. Taking turns sitting with me. Distracting me. Making sure I never had a quiet minute alone to spiral. Marisol, my 24-year-old cousin who'd refused to leave, found me near the dessert table around 8 o'clock, and said, quietly, I need to tell you something, but not tonight. Tonight, just dance with your husband. I'll always love her for that timing. Here's the part where Daniel's whispered warning came true. And it's the part of this story I think about constantly. Because it reveals something about my father that even I, having grown up with him for 18 years, didn't fully understand until it was laid out in writing. 6 weeks after the wedding, in late July, an envelope arrived at my parents' house in Modesto. Not at mine. Not at Daniel's. At my parents' house. Addressed to my father, Reynaldo Castillo, from Oak Hollow Venue. And, in a separate envelope that arrived the same week, from Poor Decisions Bar Service. The total between the two invoices came to $11,412. Here's how that happened. And I need to walk you through it carefully, because it took me weeks of going back through emails and contracts with Daniel to fully piece it together. Remember the part where my father called the venue back in May, asking about being added as an authorized contact to help with logistics? Brenda, the coordinator, had told Daniel no, she wouldn't add him without Daniel's confirmation. And Daniel had said it wasn't necessary. What none of us knew is that my father made a second call, about 10 days before the wedding. This time, not asking to be added to the account. But instead asking Brenda very specific, detailed questions. What would happen, contractually, if the guest count for catering, and the head count for the bar package, both dropped significantly the day of the event? Specifically, what would happen if 40-plus guests failed to show? Brenda, doing her job, explained the contract's minimum guarantee clause. The couple was responsible for the full contracted minimum, regardless of actual attendance. Because the kitchen and bar staff were already scheduled, and the food and liquor already ordered, based on the head count provided 30 days out. My father then asked, almost casually, according to Brenda's later recollection, whether there was any way for a guest's family, specifically, a parent of one of the parties, to step in and settle any overage directly with the venue, to keep things smooth for the couple, since this can be stressful for young people. Brenda, again with no reason to be suspicious, said that yes, technically any party could settle an invoice if the couple agreed and provided authorization. But that without prior arrangement, the invoice would go to the contracted parties, meaning Daniel and me, unless someone else had been added in advance with documented consent. My father never set up that arrangement. He never asked us. He simply orchestrated a scenario where 43 guests, almost exactly a quarter of the total invited list, would walk out together right before the ceremony. Guaranteeing that the headcount used for catering and bar overage calculations would be wildly mismatched from the headcount that actually consumed food and drinks that night. Here's the cruel mechanical detail. When 43 people leave right before a 4 o'clock ceremony, they don't eat the dinner that's already been prepared for them, which the venue still bills as a minimum guarantee. But the bar package was structured per hour, per headcount present. And the remaining 160-some guests, many of whom were already there, already nervous, already emotionally rattled by what they'd just witnessed. Ended up drinking considerably more per person than the original per-head calculation anticipated. The wedding planner's original headcount of 206 had set the bar minimums and pour rates. With fewer people consuming more each, on top of the unconsumed catering minimums for those who left, the final bill came in over the original contracted total by exactly the $11,400 figure that would later define the next 6 weeks of my life. My father had figured out, months in advance, almost to the dollar, what kind of financial chaos a coordinated walkout would create. He wasn't there to see it land. He and the others had left before the reception even began, which means he never saw a single dollar actually spent. He just knew, from his careful calls to Brenda and to poor decisions, that the structure was there, and that pulling 43 people out at the worst possible moment would trigger it. And then? And this is the detail that finally made me understand he hadn't just done something impulsive in a moment of hurt feelings. He called Oak Hollow's billing office the week after the wedding, and asked whether the invoice could be addressed to him directly. Brenda's manager, a man named Doug, who handled accounts receivable, later told Daniel on the phone, somewhat confused, that the father of the bride called and said he wanted to make sure the bill went to his address, since he was, quote, going to be settling matters of family pride personally. Doug, not knowing any better, updated the contact address on the account. So my father, having engineered the very chaos that inflated the bill, then arranged for that exact bill to land on his own doorstep. I genuinely believe, and Marisol agrees with me on this, that his plan was never about the money at all. I think it was about being able to stand in front of the rest of the family and say he'd taken care of it. That he'd handled the financial fallout of doing things their way. All while making absolutely sure that Daniel and I experienced the full, gut-wrenching terror of an $11,000 bill arriving with our names listed as the responsible parties on the original contract, before he ever stepped in. Because here's what actually happened next. The invoice itself was contractually addressed to Daniel and me, since we were the signatories. The copy that physically arrived at my parents' house was a courtesy copy Doug had mailed at my father's specific request. But the real, binding invoice came to us, at our apartment in Turlock, on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was at work. Daniel called me. And I could hear in his voice that he was trying to stay calm. He said, "Mara, I need you to sit down for this." And he read me the number. $11,412. Due within 30 days. On top of what we'd already paid for the wedding. I want to pause here for the second engagement break of this story. Because I think this moment is something a lot of people can relate to, in some form, even if the specifics are wildly different. Comment below if you've ever opened a bill, an invoice, a piece of mail, that represented not just a financial problem, but the physical proof that someone who was supposed to love you had actually planned to hurt you. There's a specific kind of grief in seeing the math laid out in black and white. Here's where I need to tell you about the hidden advantage. Because without it, I don't know how Daniel and I would have survived those 6 weeks, financially or emotionally. And the hidden advantage came, of all places, from Brenda, the venue coordinator. Brenda had worked at Oak Hollow for 9 years. She had seen plenty of difficult families, plenty of wedding day drama. But she told us later that she had never, in her entire career, watched a guest's parent call ahead of time asking detailed, specific questions about contract penalty clauses and overage structures, only to watch that same parent's side of the guest list walk out 20 minutes before the ceremony, in a coordinated group. She put it together herself, on her own, without us asking her to investigate anything. She said it didn't sit right with her. And she'd kept careful notes. Dates, times, the content of each phone call, because something about my father's questions in May had struck her as unusual enough that she'd actually written them down in the event file. The way good coordinators often do, for anything that feels like it could become a liability issue later. When Daniel called Oak Hollow in a panic after receiving the invoice, asking how the numbers had ballooned so dramatically beyond our contracted estimate, Brenda was the one who picked up. And instead of just reciting policy at him, she paused and said, "Daniel, I think there's something you and Mara need to know before you panic about this bill. She then walked him through everything. The May phone call asking about adding an authorized contact. The call 10 days before the wedding asking about minimum guarantee clauses and overage triggers. And the call after the wedding asking to redirect a courtesy copy of the invoice to his own address, while citing family pride. She had it all written down, with dates. This is the hidden advantage. Not a clever legal trick. Not a secret fund. Not some dramatic confrontation scene. Just a woman who happened to be paying close attention, and had the integrity to say something, instead of staying quiet to avoid getting involved in someone else's family mess. Armed with Brenda's notes, Daniel and I sat down with a consumer protection attorney a friend recommended. A woman named Patricia Nunez, who worked out of a small office in Modesto, and specialized in contract disputes. Patricia was very clear with us about what we actually had. And I want to be honest with you about this part, rather than oversell it for drama, because I think the honest version is more useful to anyone watching this who might be in a similar situation. We did not have a slam-dunk case to make my father legally pay the bill himself. He hadn't signed the contract. We had. And contractually, the venue and bar company were owed their money by us, regardless of why the guest count changed. What we did have was something almost more valuable. Documented, time-stamped proof, in Brenda's notes, and in Doug's own admission about the redirected courtesy invoice, that my father had specifically researched the financial penalty structure of our wedding contract in the weeks before orchestrating an event that triggered those exact penalties. Patricia's advice was simple. She said we likely couldn't sue my father and win damages outright, without an expensive, drawn-out case that probably wasn't worth the cost given our finances. But she said we absolutely could use this documentation as leverage in a direct conversation with him. Because what he had done, if it became known more broadly within the family, or even just laid out plainly to his face with dates and times, would be almost impossible for him to spin into the version of events where he was the wronged party defending tradition. It would just look like what it was. Calculated. Cold. Aimed at his own daughter, on her wedding day. So that's what we did. 3 weeks after the invoice arrived, with the 30-day deadline looming, and a payment plan from Oak Hollow already in motion to buy us time, Daniel and I drove to Modesto and asked my parents to sit down with us. My mother looked nervous the moment we walked in. Like she already knew, on some level, that this conversation had been coming since June 14th. I laid Brenda's printed notes on my parents' kitchen table, the same table I'd done homework on as a kid, and I said, "Dad, I need you to explain this to me. Why were you calling the venue in May asking about overage penalties? Why did you call again 10 days before my wedding asking what would happen if 40 people didn't show up? And why did you ask them to send the bill to this house, instead of telling us, your own kids, that you wanted to help?" My father didn't deny any of it. I think that's the detail that surprised me most. He sat there, in his usual chair, hands folded on the table, and he said, "I wanted you to understand what it costs when people don't show up for each other." I asked him what that was supposed to mean. And he said, "Daniel's family didn't show up the way family is supposed to show up for this wedding. I wanted you both to feel, just once, what it actually costs when the people who are supposed to be there for you aren't." I said, "Dad, you weren't there for me. You and Mom and my sisters and 40 other people walked out on my wedding. You did that. Daniel's mother put in $500 she didn't really have to spare. You're the one who wasn't there for me." My mother started crying at that point. And I watched my father's face do something I'd genuinely never seen it do before. A kind of crumbling. Slow and reluctant. Like he was working very hard to hold a position he no longer fully believed in himself. He said, quietly, "I thought I was teaching everyone a lesson about respect." And I said, "You taught me a lesson, Dad. Just not the one you meant to." We didn't resolve everything that day. I want to be honest about that too. Because I think tidy resolutions in these stories sometimes do a disservice to people going through something similar, and expecting their own situation to wrap up in one tearful kitchen table conversation. What we did get, that day, was an agreement. My father would cover the $11,400 bill in full. Directly. Immediately. No payment plan, no installments. Partly out of guilt. Partly, I think, because Patricia had also gently mentioned, in a follow-up letter, that documented evidence of intentionally manufacturing a contract penalty situation against your own child's wedding could, in theory, open him up to a much messier legal and reputational situation than simply paying what he'd engineered in the first place. He wrote the check within the week. Brenda confirmed receipt. The bill was settled by the second week of August. The relationships took much longer. And honestly, some of them are still being rebuilt as I record this. My mother and I talk regularly now. Real conversations, not just logistics. She told me, in one of those conversations, that she'd known what my father was planning roughly a week before the wedding. That she'd argued with him about it privately. That she'd ultimately gone along with the walkout because she didn't want to choose between her husband and her daughter in front of the whole family. Which I understand, even though I don't think it was the right choice. Lucia and Vanessa have both apologized, separately, in person. And I believe they mean it. Though I also think they were following my father's lead the way they'd followed it their entire lives. The way I think a lot of adult children follow a parent's lead, even when some part of them knows it's wrong. Teresa, interestingly, was the one who took the longest to come around. And I think that's because she has 3 young kids, and genuinely worried about what it would mean for the family if she sided too visibly with me against my father. We talk now. But it's careful. The way conversations are careful when both people know there's a fracture underneath the politeness. My cousin Marisol, the one who stayed, the one who refused to walk out with the rest of them, has become one of the most important people in my life since that day. She told me later that when my father first started organizing the walkout in the family group chat, yes, there was a separate group chat, one I wasn't part of, where my father had laid out the plan roughly a week in advance, framing it as showing solidarity as a family until things are made right. She'd been the only person under 30 in that chat who pushed back. Asking directly whether anyone had thought about what this would actually do to me, on the one day that was supposed to be about me. She told me my tia Rosa had actually agreed with her privately, but went along with the group anyway, because that's just what we do, we go along. Comment below, and this is my last engagement break for this story. If you've ever had a moment where you realized that the people who stayed, even if there were fewer of them, mattered more than the people who left. No matter how many of them there were. I think about Marisol, about Priya and Sophia, about Carol, Daniel's mother, every single day. 43 people left my wedding. 160-something stayed. And one 24-year-old cousin refused to be part of something she knew was wrong, even when the rest of her family pressured her to fall in line. Here's where I've landed, almost a year out from that day. And I want to share it, because I think it's the part of this story that actually matters more than the invoice. More than the math. More than the specific cruelty of what my father did. I used to believe that family loyalty meant going along with the script, even when the script didn't fit the life you were actually building. I think my father believed that too. Just from the other direction. That loyalty meant enforcing the script on everyone else, even at the cost of the people he loved. What I learned, standing at that altar with 43 empty chairs in front of me, is that the people who choose to show up for you, especially when showing up costs them something, are telling you something far more honest about love than people who show up automatically because tradition says they have to. Daniel's mother putting in $500 she could barely spare meant more than any amount of money my father could have spent trying to prove a point. Marisol staying behind, knowing it would isolate her from people she'd have to keep seeing at every family gathering for the rest of her life, meant more than 43 people performing solidarity in a group chat I wasn't even invited to. I don't think my father is a monster. I think he's a man who confused control with love for most of his life, and never had anyone close enough to him tell him the difference, until his own daughter had to lay the proof out on his kitchen table. I think some of you watching this might recognize a parent like that in your own life. Someone who loves you in a way that's also, somehow, about winning. About being right. About making a point land exactly where they intended it to land. I don't have a tidy answer for how to fix that in someone else. I only know what I did. Which was tell the truth, calmly, with documentation, and let him sit with what he'd actually done, instead of the story he'd told himself about why he was doing it. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. And I'd really love to hear your answer in the comments. If you were standing where I was standing, at the altar, watching 43 chairs empty out right before the most important moment of your life, would you have stopped the ceremony to go after them? Or would you have done what I did, and kept walking forward toward the person who was actually still standing there with you? I think about that question a lot. I think the answer says something about what we actually believe a wedding, or any big moment in our lives, is for. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and hit subscribe. Because I've got more stories like this one coming. Real ones. About families, and the complicated, sometimes beautiful, sometimes devastating things we do to each other in the name of love. Drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. And let me know what you would have done in my place. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.